Yeah, delighted to be here, and it looks a really interesting and impressive meeting. And I've enjoyed the talks I've heard so far. So I'd like to talk about wilding, managing on mollycoddling, an evidence-based approach to restoring nature. So this is what we're sort of hoping for. This is the sort of vision of wilderness that so many of us think of when we think of wilding. But then if you look at what we actually have, you look at Suffolk reserves, and here are two fine examples of Suffolk reserves. Here's the Brandon Artemisia Reserve. I was showing some Finnish colleagues this last weekend who were bemused by it. And here is the Military Orchid Reserve. And both, they're both great reserves doing great jobs, but they're not exactly wilderness. So what's the problem? What can we do about this? So we have succession that takes place, and you obviously all know about succession, how if you leave an area bare, then grass and other plants will come in, and then over time that will be converted to shrubs or savanna, depending on when you are, and then eventually you'll have forest. That's successional process, well known. But then look at the this is the classification I did, where I looked at the number of birds, terrestrial birds, that like each of those habitats. And stone curlews on the left like bare habitats, but a quarter of the species like the sort of grassy areas, half of them like shrubby areas, but only a quarter of them like forest habitats. And even some of those, like lesser spotted woodpeckers, they don't like thick forest. They're like a more complex forest than that. So although succession means that we'll have more and more forest, most of our species don't actually like forest. They like shrubby habitats or more open areas. So how can that be? If we think of Britain just as thick forest in its past, how come most of the species we have aren't species of mixed forest? I'd like to briefly talk about some of the possible explanations. So one of those is people say, oh yes, but all these habitats, all these species survived in other habitats like riverbanks and shingle. The problem with that is if you look at riverbanks and shingle, you don't find a great mass of species that would persist in there. There's some nice, interesting species, but it clearly isn't the case that most of the British flora and fauna were surviving in these habitats until forest clearance took place. Another possibility is that a lot of them have arrived recently, and that certainly is part of the answer. So we have 1,400 native species, but if you look at the archaeophytes that arrived a long time ago, and some of these have arrived with sort of Neolithic times, including things like white dead nettle that you think of very much as a native species, but also corncockle, species that have arrived for some time. And then neophytes have arrived more recently, and then casuals have appeared very recently. So a lot of our species have arrived relatively recently, and that does seem to be part of the explanation. So if there was more open forest, as it's been cleared, then other species, particularly species of farmland, have arrived with the Neolithic revolution from further east. The next possible explanation is that that disturbance takes place. So that although succession is moving habitats from more and more forested, then you have fires and floods and disease that sets it all back and pushes it through again. And there probably is, again, there's some truth in this, and actually are disasters. It doesn't seem as though our forests burn at all well, though they might well do in the future. So burning probably isn't it, but floods and diseases and those sorts of things, and frost and occasionally snowfall will occasionally create open areas, and succession will take place. But it doesn't seem that we live in a massively disturbed habitat. And then we have grazing, that if you have grazing, grazing of forests and savannas and grasslands, you'll push patches back. If you have, depending on how far back you go, if you have elephants or mammoths grazing our forests, or aurochs and bison pushing things back, then you might well have a more complex mosaic of habitats. And this is part of the sort of the NEP model of diversity caused partly by grazing. So what do we do about it? Well, one common solution is just to say, well, what we ought to do is just leave things alone. You know, if you leave things alone, it's great. And so this is Monkswood National Nature Reserve, set up as a national nature reserve, particularly for its butterflies. It had 40 species of butterflies, just amazing diversity of butterflies. And it was left alone because that's what you do with nature reserves. And then 12 of the species disappeared, including pearl-bordered, small pearl-bordered, high-brown, silver-wash fritillaries, 12 in total. So lots of others have disappeared since 1954. And it was clear at that time that fencing reserves was a disaster, that the diversity of reserves was higher in forestry commission plantations than it was on national nature reserves, which is an extremely embarrassing statistic. It showed the need for disturbance. So the way you can think about it is there's two extremes in managing habitats, one of which is what I call mollycoddling. It's looking after it. And this is what's done in Brandon Artemisia Reserve, and it's the right thing to do. This is the main natural site for field woundwort, Artemisia campestris in Britain. And so it's disturbed because it requires disturbed ground. It's fenced because it seems that it's very sensitive to grazing. It's sort of mollycoddled and protected and looked after. And it does pretty well there. It's a good thing to do. But really, what I think many of us would like to see is to move away from that and move towards a system where you have natural disturbed breckland habitat and where you have areas where it will survive because there are sand blowouts and disturbances and floods and frost and all this sort of thing, which creates open patchy habitats and disturbance from the grazing bison and all those sorts of things. So that within this mosaic, there are areas where the Artemisia will survive. And it might be ephemeral. It might be that you have an area where, due to disturbance, bison disturbance or whatever it is, the species finds some suitable habitat, occurs there for a few years, and then disappears, dies out, but moves somewhere else. The idea of a meta-population, a population of populations. So within this habitat, they'll move around from one patch to another. And like in the Artemisia Reserve, where we're sort of pickling it in time and saying it has to stay like this forever, or that species will go extinct. So they're the two versions. And what we really want to do, I think, is try and find ways in which we can move to how we could fund it. Let's think about if we could have local government organizations provide funding for ecosystem services, sort of think of this rather like national parks. So that funding would occur at a local level, and then within a catchment, you might say, what's the most effective way of funding the services that could be provided by a catchment? Next, please. And then obviously grazers. That's great that grazers are being introduced. It's great that bison are now occurring down in Kent and others are occurring. So that's a great way of improving the habitat disturbance. And that's sort of key to many of these elements. Next, please. And just to say that within this, there's lots of interest in restoration on the River Lark. This is a River Lark restoration project that I'm keen on. There's Glenn and his team. Next, please. And I never thought I would say that I've been releasing beavers with Michael Gove, but there he was doing this. And so there is all of this interest, all of this concern in doing something about it and in restoring and maintaining habitats, rewilding habitats, reintroducing natural systems. Next, please. Next slide, please. But then what are the other elements we need to consider? Should we go back a slide? Oh, what other elements do we need to consider? There's problems with aliens. So the top left is Dothosterma, red needle blight, which is affecting the Corsican pines. The Corsican pine, an awful lot of Thetford forest is Corsican pines, and they're almost all going to go because of the severity of this problem. And we know ash dieback, and then we know problems with bark beetles elsewhere. The emerald borer, ash borer is likely to come, another serious problem. We just have more and more invasive pests and tree diseases, and we have to be able to deal with those. Next, please. And climate change. So we think of climate change as being good, you know, that lots of species that are spreading, which is great. And it'd be great to have species that are on the edge of their range that are doing much better. We need to think about how we embed that, and particularly how do we make habitats that are more resilient to climate change. So that for me, a lot of that is by having the greater diversity, so that within a natural diverse habitat, then these species can find a range. They can find the drier bits in wet years and the wetter bits, cooler bits in hot years. Providing that moving diverse habitat seems to be key. Next, please. So this is the different processes I talked about, from mollycoddling to managing standard nature reserves to leaving to having natural processes. They're the sort of the different levels you can have. And this is what how do we apply those to patches and sites and landscape? So I'd argue that when you've got small patches, then mollycoddling is kind of essential. At Brandon Artemisi Reserve, that's what we want to be doing. If you've got sites, then managing those is often standard, because you've got to keep the grazing within that field at a reasonable level. Otherwise, it will disappear and it can't move elsewhere. But managing on landscape levels is difficult. But then for natural processes, if we are going to think about natural landscape scale conservation, then really we should be thinking, can we allow natural processes to play a much larger role? Next, please. And that's going to increase the need to have diverse habitats in which a range of species can occur. Next, please. And then if we have some sort of more structured process, as I was talking about with the ecological policies, then again, we can think of landscape scale, how we can manage whole catchments to make them more resilient to flooding. Next, please. Landscape restoration is something that we're talking about much more, that the Endangered Landscape Programme, that the National Trusts and various other, the RSPB, all sorts of people are talking about restoring at landscapes in the way that they weren't talking about 10 years ago. Next, please. And then climate resilience, that if we, as I said, if we want to have climate resilience, we really want interconnected patches, we want a diversity of habitats, a diversity of opportunities, so that species can move around according to their requirements in ways that we don't really understand. Next, please. And then ideally, we can move away from this management of patches, this fiddling around, this protecting species on roadside nature reserves and in little areas, because most of those species will occur in larger areas. The Breckland specialities, the Breckland floral group is a fantastic group in terms of understanding and protecting Breckland species, but it's protecting them in little patches, which is the right thing to do. It's protecting them in roadside verges and little patches in various areas. We really want to move so that these occur within a larger landscape. Next, please. So that's the vision. And it's it's related to the Lawton Review, which I was involved in the Lawton Review, and it's really delighted by how well it has done. And the idea of creating more habitats and better habitats and bigger habitats and making them more joined up seems to have done very well. And again, that's about creating landscape scale habitat features. Next, please. So this is just a plug for the book we produced, came out last year, open access. But in that, we're very much interested in how you take the evidence and how you apply the evidence to decision making. And the concern we have is that we're far less effective than we could be by not using the evidence. We think we could probably double our effectiveness by doing conservation better. Next, please. So how do we do this? We have a process we call subject-wide evidence synthesis. So supposing we're interested in bats, we say, what are the threats? One of the threats to bats is wind turbines. And what are the options? You could switch them off when the wind is slow, because that's when they tend to get nobbled, or you could deter bats using ultrasound, or you could deter bats using radar. Next, please. And then we've read the main conservation journals. Next, please. And we've read, because this is a bat review, and we've now reviewed it for all the bats groups, we've read the main bat mammal journals, and we've done this in 17 different languages. Next, please. And there's only a small number of papers that actually test actions. So conservationists tend to concentrate on threats and the biology of systems, and they tend not so much to test what needs to be done. Next, please. So you can pull out the papers in these journals that test actions, and then here's just a list of some of those. Next, please. And then this is the clever bit. We've provided our list of threats, we've provided our list of options, we've extracted the literature, and we then just put them together. And because we've done it at scale, we can review the evidence for a couple of hundred different possible actions for bat conservation. And many of them, I don't know, probably about a quarter of them have no evidence, but that's fine, because we've shown that out. And this is a very cost-effective way of reviewing the literature and making it available. Next, please. So just as one example, this is the famous bat bridges that you'll see over the A11. They've been built in 17 different areas. So we spent over £1 million on bat gantries. And when you, this diagram shows, the little arrow shows where they used to occur, shows where the gantry is, and this dark area shows where they are now. It shows they haven't moved their communal route. They're ignoring the bat gantry. So there's no evidence that it works. And I'm not critical of this as an idea. I'm very much in favor of innovating and thinking of new ideas. What I'm strongly opposed to is moving from an idea to best practice without testing in between. That's where the disasters are. And there's a number of other examples of that. Next, please. So this is how we put all our literature on a website, Conservation Evidence. So this just shows some of the options for looking after bats. There's a range of different approaches. And if you're not going to have bat gantries, you can have underpasses. They seem to be quite effective, or overpasses, or green bridges. There's only one study, so the evidence for that is unclear. So we're very keen on making the evidence available so people can use it and we can improve our effectiveness. Next, please. So do nest boxes help bumblebees? So people tend to know one of two things. They either know that they're very effective. Next, please. A useful means of helping bumblebees. You can buy them at garden centers, etc. Or quite a few people know about the study in Sheffield. Next, please. Which shows that they're a complete waste of time. So people tend to know one of those two facts. If you actually look at the literature, you see that there are a range of different studies and they have a range of conclusions. Next, please. So the ones in the early ones in North America show they seem to work. Next, please. The ones in the UK show they tend not to work. Next, please. If you look at them underground, next, please. The ones in the States found that they work. Next, please. One in the UK found that they're actually quite successful. Next, please. Over in New Zealand, where obviously bumblebees are introduced, they're increased with older boxes. So we've moved from the simplistic, do they work or don't, to say, well, they work in some areas, but not others. Perhaps that's different sorts of nest boxes or different sorts of bees. They work underground. They work for old nest boxes. You can learn from this and move on. Next, please. Or managing field sites for bees. Again, we know what you're supposed to do, create wildflower margins for bees. We know that is the thing to do. But if you look at the details, if you just leave them unsprayed for a season, it has no real effect. If you let it to naturally regenerate over time, it can get better, but the value to bumblebees largely depends on the thistle species, and farmers sometimes spray out the thistles. If you sow with wildflower mix, that's actually pretty good. If you use agricultural bee forage plants, that's even better. But you've got to decide there are other reasons for this. And if you sow with grasses, it can be good for nesting sites. So we've moved from the simplistic, just do it, to say there's a range of different approaches. Some don't work, some do. That's what we want to know. Next, please. And then one of the things we're interested in is guidance. So we've collated the evidence, but obviously most people, it's actually quite easy to look up, but most people, they really want guidance to see what to do, as happens in medicine. And this is from some guidance from a very well-known site, How to Grow Mistletoe. So grow it in the same species. Well, actually, I've investigated that in some detail. There isn't actually any evidence for that, though they're testing it in Oxford. Discard any crushed berries. So if you were given some berries and some of them were crushed, would you throw them away or would you use them? Personally, I would use them. Don't use those in Christmas because they're generally harvested when they're immature. I was chatting to some botanists about that, and we were working out whether or not that's true. I confess they doubted it. Choose a branch that's 15 years old or more. Well, actually, it seems people now say that you want the younger branches. And then these three, you find a natural cavice, you insert them, you cover it in hessian. We now know that mistletoe are very light sensitive, and if you do these, it just doesn't work. So this is the standard guidance, and it is all completely wrong. And this seems to often be the case. We looked at 200 bits of guidance, and an awful lot of it isn't based on the evidence. An awful lot of it isn't right. We need evidence-based guidance. And be serious about using guidance rather than just sitting down and saying what we think. Next, please. So we think that we should be embedding evidence into practice, and that some organizations have taken it very seriously. So the Kent Wildlife Trust looked at their 550 actions they've carried out and looked to see how effective it seems to be, looking at the conservation evidence database, 136 that there wasn't any evidence available, but showed that many of them were likely to be beneficial, but particularly there was 13 that were likely to be ineffective or harmful, or 7 that were unlikely to be beneficial. And they concentrated on that effort to work out those issues where there's likely to be more thinking is useful. Is it that we've got these wrong, or is it that the evidence is a bit insufficient? Next, please. So, and then we think what we really want to be doing is learning from practice. So we see this as key, that that if we embedded experiments in tests, in conservation practice, then we could greatly improve our effectiveness. And we think the way to think about this is with this Venn diagram. So firstly, at the top left, you want to say, are there things that we don't know? Is it that we don't know the best way of treating this invasive plant, say? Then the bottom, we want to say, is it possible to embed a test within the management plan? Is it possible to have patches of that plant that you treat in different ways, that you treat some in the spring and some in the summer? You treat some by cutting, some by spraying, some by pulling up, etc. And then finally, at the right-hand corner, do you have the relevant skills? Is there someone that would go along and could count the abundance of each of those plants, or the survival, or the percentage flowering, or whatever, and then write that up? And if you have those, then design an experiment. And we think that building experiments into practice is a key stage for the future. Next, please. So to summarize, next, please. Mollycoddling is essential for critical cases. Next. We really want to move to landscape solutions if we can. Next. A network is key. Next, please. Many widely accepted activities might not actually be tested. Next, please. And when they are tested, many of them turn out not to work and to be ineffective. And so we're wasting money and effort in doing that. Next, please. The details really matter. The details as to how you create your wildflower mix. We also know from other work, the Breton Floral Group, the way in which you prepare the ground is critical. Those details really matter. Next, please. And we need guidance to enable practitioners to decide what to do, but that has to be better guidance based on evidence, rather than people just sitting down and putting their opinions down. Next, please. And testing is important if we're going to move forward. And then probably finally, another one. Yeah, we need to deliver at scale. And delivering at scale, if we can do that, is absolutely critical. So thanks for all people doing that. And then finally, let's move on. So I just want to be positive about changes taking place. I know some of you have seen the slide before. Here are 2 examples. Firstly, it's a demonstration. It says, what do we want? Evidence-based change. When do we want it? After peer review. Although I notice it's the only poster saying that, but anyway, it's good to do one. And then next, I think you can tell it's a bit of an old, well, it's a slightly old photo of me. My kids are at university or been to university. Next, please. Anna Sutherland's school report for science. Next, please. She's progressing well. Next, please. But must take a more evidence-based approach. It's a bit shocking indictment for me as a father. But that just shows the fact that at the age of 10, they're expected to take an evidence-based approach. To me, is extremely good news that things are likely to move forward. Next, please. And then finally, if you want to read this book, we've got lots of stuff on how to write guidance, how to write evidence-based management plans. Here's the QR code.
Neil Armachelu, how do you get policy change directed towards ecosystem service-driven incentives?
It's a really interesting question. The clever idea of the BSPP is that they would provide a budget for that task. They would say, within this catchment, we want to stop flooding occurring downstream. Or within this area, we want to reduce the nitrate pollution in the chalk aquifer. What are the actions that could be taken place that will be beneficial? And then people could bid to then make their proposals. And it seems to be a very attractive way, if that's possible to do, by having a high-level system. And I think we just need to recognize that there are multiple benefits from nature and that we fund those where they occur. Often it's about tourism. So where Jake is, that I remember that landscape as a student. I remember Holcombe as a student, which was bleak arable lands. And it is now stunning, and large numbers of people come and visit it and spend money as a result. And the biodiversity gains are remarkable. And I imagine Jake could identify some other gains in terms of flood protection, etc. So it's working out what those are.
Rob Fuller, playing devil's advocate to some extent, one could argue that moving conservation in the direction of relatively hands-off is an act of faith. We don't have a strong evidence base about how biodiversity will respond in reality, except for the early stages of these projects. So how do we accumulate evidence about how these approaches will deliver in the long term?
And I fully take that criticism, but we need to look at those occasions where that's been occurring, and we need to learn from those. We need to try to set this up as experiments so we can learn more from that. But there is an element of faith in this process, as was discussed previously. From NEP, it wasn't entirely clear where NEP was going to go. And there's a range of species that we thought we understood. We thought we understood what turtle doves like. We thought we understood what purple hair streaks like. We thought we understood what large tortoiseshells like. And NEP has shown that we don't, that they actually occur very different habitats. And the same, I think, is probably true in the fens, that we tend to manage so habitats are fixed at ecological stages. There's open water and reeds and alder and willow, shrub, and then forest. There's accumulating evidence that the diverse habitats are where black-necked grebes and Savvy's warblers and bluethroats and Balon's crates occur. They occur where succession's taking place. They occur where reeds are growing over open water, where shrub is moving into reed beds. And we can only create that if we have much more dynamic systems. So I think it is a certain amount of faith. There is some evidence to show that this is working. But my expectation is that a lot of exciting things will reappear if we create a much more dynamic system. That's a lesson from NEP. I suspect the same is true for the fens. It's true of a lot of habitats, that we're just going to have all sorts of surprises, all sorts of good surprises.
Anna Saltmarsh, what are your thoughts on how expansion of evidence base for conservation interventions can or should be resourced? And how to ensure long-term impacts of specific interventions, or lack of, are able to be assessed or compared without changing priorities, meaning inconsistent practice over time?
The funding of it is, ideally we would like governments and businesses to fund it. They're the main beneficiaries. Unfortunately, governments tend to say, well, we're only interested in this one topic, rather than we want to review the literature on a broad scale. And businesses tend to say, why should we fund something that someone else would gain from? So at the moment, philanthropists are the main providers of funders for that evidence base at the moment, which isn't really how it should be. In terms of changing, there's if you learn, then I'm a great favor in changing. That's what science does. Science is you find out something different and you change your mind. And government, so we learned that in COVID, that if governments say we thought this, but the evidence has turned out differently, then society will move along with that. And to me, it is madness to do things that we know don't work. So I think we should just be continually learning, continually embedding tests in actions, continue reviewing the literature. And when we discover something's different, it's a little bit embarrassing, but we change it. Progress.
Hamish Jackson, do you have any views on the forthcoming schedules of the Environment Act and the need to deliver a 10% measurable biodiversity net gain using the DEFRA metrics? Do you have concerns that this approach will not be sufficiently evidenced to deliver functional biodiversity net gains once it is a requirement across the UK by winter 2023?
So metrics are kind of complicated, because the great thing about climate change is carbon's a pretty easy metric to measure, and it's very easy to say whether or not it's increasing or not. Biodiversity is much more complex. So the DEFRA metrics it's an ugly beast, but it's sort of a moderately effective beast as a way of progressing, but it's not. It's far from perfect. I'm sure evidence too. I was thinking there's a couple of studies, one looking at biodiversity net gain for development and showing that most of that is done in-house. And if it's done in-house, you don't really know what's being done. And the studies show that a quarter of it tends not to be done at all. A quarter of it is done really badly. And then the remainder is sort of done all rightish. And they've also looked at what guidance they use. And almost always they use guidance that isn't evidence-based. It's based on guidance and kind of likely to be sort of a fairly ineffective way of doing it. The advantage of paying sort of banking and having it done elsewhere has the advantage that it's likely to be longer term, and that seems a very sensible approach. But most developers aren't taking that approach.
Adam Gretton, would you welcome a new supplementary payment in ELMS for habitat connectivity? This has been encouraged in the past, but not directly paid for. Any have proposed this to DEFRA, and discussions on the detail continue.
We know large, that they're kind of isolated, but if we can connect them up to other bits of habitat and identify the key locations where a bit of habitat would make a real difference. That's why there's an organization called Saving Species that does that on a global basis. They work out which species are threatened, which are the key bits of habitat you need to link patches together. And I think we need a lot more thinking in that sort of way.
Mike Gillett, what are your thoughts on the urgency for action, but the frequent lack of good evidence? The problem I see is that, for birds at least, most specialist species are in decline, and for many we don't know what the relative contributions are of the set of likely drivers of declines. If we wait for good evidence on works, we will be waiting a long time, during which declines will continue if we don't try something.
Indisputably. But there's another side to that. I've got what I call my party trick, which is that I attend government meetings of serious conservationists, and often they're talking about an effectiveness of an action, and I'll look it up on my phone, I'll look it up on conservation evidence or other sources and say, well, the evidence shows this. And that searching takes another couple of minutes. So that my concern is very often that there's evidence there that we're just not using. And I think that is indefensible, that we need to reflect. I'm not saying you follow it, you reflect on the evidence and work out what it means, and then you combine that with your knowledge and your experience and values to decide what to do. But there are other occasions when we don't know what to do. And there, I would say we need to act. We need to make decisions. We need to bring together experts, work out what the most likely causes of decline are, what the best solutions are likely to be, and start putting those in practice. But as we don't know, we test at the same time so that we don't find that 10 years' time, we're still saying we don't know why this species has declined. We don't know why spotted flycatchers have declined, and we're still going to do these things which don't seem to have worked. We've actually learned as we progressed. So use the information we have, make decisions, but if you make decisions which you don't really know what you're doing, then make sure you embed tests.